Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Detections Podcast. We're here for episode 2, Threat Intelligence Games, with your hosts,
Exiled Atreides
and Understudy 77. Before we get into it, there's one thing we didn't say last week that's kind of important, and we should just mention this. The views and opinions expressed here are the views and opinions of two people. What we think, what we believe, what we know, they don't in any way, shape, or form reflect kind of the views of the places that we work for, which are completely different places. With that out of the way, I just want to say, we are back, continuing our quest to make Blue Team sexy. And that's exactly why we do a podcast, because if you saw us, it wouldn't be possible.
for sure. All right, so now that that's out of the way, you were at B-Sides this last weekend in DC.
So were you.
In Portland.
Yeah. I thought it was Portland. Man, so admittedly and honestly, I love B-Sides events. I really do. They're small and personal and wonderful, and I like everything about B-Sides events. I think they're some of my favorites. I had a buddy of mine come down. It was really enjoyable. I got to see a bunch of people I haven't seen in a long time. Also enjoyable. And I got to talk twice.
Damn.
Also enjoyable. But they were back to back. So that was something. The first talk we did not record. So for anybody who didn't make it, no, you can't see it. It was a little bit on the sensitive side. It was called Blue Team Horror Stories. And it was full of shenanigans. So many shenanigans. It was great. The second talk, however, is posted on the blog at detections.org and on YouTube by B-Sides. And that was called What Did the Sims See? And I think that'll be a really cool topic for another day just to have here, talking about hybrid alerting methodology and things like that. But, Exiled, how was your B-Sides?
Well, it was a lot of what you were talking about. Well, what's nice, what makes it small. You get a chance to see people that you haven't seen in a while. I only showed up Friday, the first day of the 2-day event, just to pick up my badge and kind of scope things out because had a bunch of stuff planned for work. And ended up getting distracted for 8 hours with people that I'd known and hadn't seen from 6 months to a year on the first day. So no talks. Actually, the whole weekend I only saw one talk. The rest of the time was that whole getting caught up. And I ended up giving an impromptu lightning talk just about the podcast as a total shameless plug. And also as a way to be on stage beside a friend of mine who was looking to try out to see if he wanted to do more of the public presentation stuff. So I totally signed him up, totally gave him a topic to go, and he did fantastic.
Nice. So for anybody who's listening from either of those events who found out at this podcast, because I also did get a chance to briefly mention it, it wasn't quite the 10-minute lightning talk. But for anybody who has joined us from those events, welcome, and it was a pleasure to meet you.
Yes, conversations were great for everyone that I did have a chance to talk to. And actually, there was a really cool thing that happened at B-Sides PDX from those 2 lightning talks. There was a young woman who's attending a local university in the law school, and she recognized a gap as being a student between the information security and the legal worlds. So she stepped out of the way to come in, try to make connections, try to learn what's going on from people who are involved in the industry, to see what she can do from the career path she's deciding to go to help bridge that gap. So, and some of you may have seen me tweet about it from my personal account. And she did show up at a local meetup called RainSec to help get it going. It's pretty exciting to see non-traditional InfoSec or technically minded people starting to join the community here.
Of course, and that sounds way more productive than mine. I stayed up way too late. I got pelted by beef jerky thrown by children, and I was thrown money to dance on stage, and I complied.
Too bad that wasn't recorded.
I'm glad it wasn't, and I don't think I ever would have done it if it was. It was a unique experience shared by me and a group of a couple hundred people, and I'd like to keep it that way and nice and intimate and wonderful. But it really, really was a blast. I got to talk with some really, really smart people way smarter than me, which are genuinely the people that I try to do talks with because they make me look good. and that's always fantastic.
Yes. So B-sides out of the way. News. What do you got for us?
Dude, so many hacks. Like, just so much stuff has happened recently. So let's dive right into it. So, and two of these are a little bit broader. So we'll do the broad ones first. So I read an article that I think just got released today. By the way, for anybody who's going to be listening to this soon, it's just about Halloween. So happy Halloween, because I love this time of year. It's fantastic. So the count of managed service providers getting hit with ransomware mounts. So this one's really interesting because threat researchers tracking public reports of managed service provider ransomware incidents count up to 13, meaning 13 different managed service providers have been hacked and have been used as a pivot point into customers. It's really interesting as it brings us into like supply chain stuff. And I've seen it a lot. I've seen it like, a email compromise happens and then they hit their entire client list. But in this case, like these guys have direct access to infrastructure. So you hit them and then you can pivot to a whole bunch of different customers. Like it's a really effective entry vector.
Oh yeah, for sure. As being someone who works for one of those managed service providers currently, like I can totally see how getting inside of one of ours, it's like one of those exponential increases, right? Get inside our network, use those trusted connectors. And actually, wasn't that the basis of how back in the day, the HB Gary, the non-federal side, had their little snafu?
Yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar, and you're probably right. It's one of those things. So like, not only from like a vet perspective, right? But like, vet your providers, but at the same time, like remember that everybody that you let touch your network and have access to your network is a potential attack vector. And we are really entering in the world of like security as a service. Like that's becoming the hotness. That's becoming the thing, right? We're hosting tools in the cloud where other people are hosting everything. We're moving infrastructure to AWS. We're putting a good majority of our stuff in other people's hands. And in one sense, sure, that kind of does this whole thing where like shift of blame. But at the same time, your data is still your data. And everybody has valuable data.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about, so I just shared that article internally for the company that I work for because I don't think anyone else recognized it, so I already put the use. But also, like, it's not uncommon for managed service providers or managed security service providers to be a little behind on the maturity and capability scale compared to the bigger corporations. So some of them can be those easier, lower effort targets that get you that trusted connection back into your actual target, and they're more being used as a pivot point than the actual target.
Oh yeah, because I mean they can provide all the security in the world to you, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the most secure themselves. And I can tell you as a security person that like my personal hygiene is not as good as what I preach. That's probably true of most of us. I do a bit, but
Yeah, I'd say that's mostly true for us. I'd say the big difference is we just have a bigger understanding of our risk appetite, and so we just accept some of it for the convenience.
Sure, that makes sense. So let's move on to another one that's also kind of interesting and kind of comes along the same vein. I'm shifting it up. I'm changing it live, but. So we talk about, who you trust, right? Like putting data in the hands of people that you trust. Hackers steal crypto keys for NordVPN. I use NordVPN. A lot of people use NordVPN. They're a trusted VPN provider. They work well. They're decent. But like anything, they got popped. Now that said, a couple things. First off, the tagline of this thing is breach happened 19 months ago, only being disclosed now. And I remember a lot of people doing this with the Equifax thing. And the Equifax thing, in and of itself, was a whole different story because of some of the shit that happened. But breaches take a long time to scope. Like, if you don't know the scope, you don't want to put out a statement until you know what happened. Source, I used to investigate breaches for a living. They can take time, especially some of the bigger ones. So far for Nord, it looks mostly contained, which means it doesn't look like it's going to be too bad. Will I still use them as a VPN provider? Yeah, probably. Because breaches happen. That's just the world that we live in. I just saw a statistic yesterday that, like, in 2019 alone, breaches are up like 54%. And 2018 was another record year.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
But here's something kind of newer. And people have been talking about this for a while, right? IoT devices, your Nest thermostats, your smart lights, all that crap. So Kaspersky put out honeypots. In the first half of 2019, take a guess at how many attacks they found against IoT devices from their honeypots.
I'll take a guess, but I'm also curious as to how they're defining attack. Let's go, I don't know, in the double-digit millions?
Try triple-digit millions. 105 million attacks. From 276,000 unique IPs. By the way, the first half of 2018 was 12 million. So that's a huge increase.
Huge. What was it, like almost a tenfold factor increase?
Pretty much about a tenfold factor increase. It's just crazy. And you're talking about, like, their 50 honeypots, which were deployed for more than a year, resulted in 20,000 infected sessions every 15 minutes.
Damn.
Right? Now, Mirai and Naya Drop accounted for 39% of the attacks split. So what is that? Almost 80% of the total. So exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities and using password brute forcing were the most common ways to go. Mirai being a malware family that looks for weak IoT devices and then uses them for DDoS attacks on other things.
Yeah.
It's really genuinely interesting, though. And, like, we're hitting that point with smart homes and all this stuff that, like, now you actually kind of do have to start caring. And for the most part, like, what security monitoring can you do on most of your IoT devices? Like, you can watch network traffic, sure, but what can you really do there? You don't really control their patching cycle. You don't really control a lot of things about those devices. They're pretty shut out to you. Anyway.
Yeah,
that's my stuff.
And that's also reflected not just in the home stuff, but like HVAC, like thermostats and things like that are becoming part of this same, like, Internet of Things, becoming web addressable, and those are not uncommon to just see openly available to the public, so the vendor can go in and do software updates.
There's a website for cameras that does that. That'll just, like, find random open cameras and let you look at them. I can't remember the website off the top of my head, but I know it exists.
That reminds me of when one of the talks at DEF CON, what was it? Probably like 4 years ago now, and they did like a chat roulette of that. They just looked for open VNC connections and just shared the desktop in like a chat roulette style.
Jeez. Such is the world that we live in.
Oh, yeah. So on the note, like you were saying, what do I got? On the same note with the hacks and things going on, we have the Discord, right? People in the industry, people gaming, like, we use Discord a lot. I don't know if people have seen this, but there's a back door that has been written and apparently been shared over Discord messaging that turns Discord itself, the client, into the malware.
So how exactly are they exploiting this one?
So apparently the Discord client is using built on, what is it, the Electron, which effectively is CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. So what they're doing is they're changing one of the JavaScript files in the client of the desktop client of Discord, putting their malware code in that JavaScript file, and then forcing a restart.
Now, there is one thing that's important to mention here for all you Mac users out there. So far, they've only seen this for Windows Discord client.
Yes, and reading through the article that we'll put in the blog post later, in that very article, there were some people saying, like, it's already turned off or not available, like they're not seeing it in the wild anymore. And they give some pretty good things to check in the module section of the desktop to try to find if your client version itself is compromised. And they even lay out some of the Discord API calls and webhooks that the malware does itself. So
Yeah, so
there's some interesting things you can use to look for it.
So where it gets a little creepy is what it collects, because not only does it collect like user tokens and screen resolution and stuff, it'll also grab like username, email address, phone number, and whether or not you have stored payment information.
And the really creepy thing is the first 50 characters of your clipboard.
Oh God, yeah. I don't think anybody wants to see the contents of my clipboard.
Well, some people may pay for it, but they're getting it for free.
True.
So
we had to figure that this was going to be a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, Discord's incredibly popular at this point. Like, we had to figure it was going to be a thing.
at some point, I mean, and if it is like this, using CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, like there's gonna be smart people who are gonna find ways to leverage it. So, like you were saying, like there's going to be breaches, and that's what we're here for, to try to help people get a better understanding of how to watch for these things.
Potentially how to find them, how to see that they're there, how to, go hunt.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's not like you can get away from a lot of this stuff. Like, IoT devices are here to stay. Discord, probably here to stay. I still use it. Risks and all.
Yeah, and I've seen more and more people embracing Discord because it's free, and the voice channels, right? It's a lot easier to use the voice channel to get a bunch of people to collaborate on something than like Slack conference calls, Microsoft Teams conference calls, and things like that.
Especially because you only get that as like a paid user.
Exactly.
You don't really have that problem with Discord, which is nice.
Yeah, very nice.
So I think that covers the breaches, right?
It does. It does cover the breaches, and the last two things that I have are very interesting. The first one's actually around a bill that Senator Ron Wyden is trying to pass called, what was it, the Mind Your Own Business Act of 2019, where he's proposing legislation that would hold senior executives inside of a company criminally liable and steep financial fines for knowingly lying to the FTC.
Interesting. So, give me the deets.
All right. So, the first part of it is kind of like laying out the reason behind it, showing how FTC current rules is more of a slap on the wrist and not anything stiff enough to make these CEOs take citizens' privacy seriously. So, they have 6 sections here that the act will cover. The first one being a minimum privacy and cybersecurity standards, the fines and the criminal penalties. The fines would be up to 4% of the company's annual revenue on the first offense, and a 10 to 20 year criminal penalty for the senior executives. Creating a national do not track system, and making sure companies that would have a per charge service available for the consumers of theirs, to basically like Google, Facebook, that you could pay them to not track you, versus them offering the free service where they collect all your information.
Okay. So first off, let's talk about that for a second. But before I get to there, I do just want to say, yes, it's almost 2020, and I did indeed say, give me the deets.
That's dope.
Anyway. So, now like, if you choose the do not track option, they're probably going to charge you some sum of money, and it's probably not going to be insignificant, to be honest. Especially given that people's lives are tied up into this. And we can talk about, like, the implications of this model of the internet. As much of, like, I go, woo, this is a great idea, like, there's also going to be serious implications. But first off, how much do you think Facebook makes per user?
Facebook makes per user off of the data they collect and then sell. Are we talking per month or per year?
Per year.
I'm going to say somewhere in the range of $125,000 a year.
You think so? Per user?
Per user.
Not even close.
Shit. What is it?
Way down.
So are we talking hundreds of dollars?
No, we're talking about $20.
$20 over a year.
$20 per person over a year. That was the last estimate. It was in about 2018. But remember, they have billions of users, right? So $20 per user is no insignificant amount of money. Jesus, if they made like $100,000 per user, you'd be talking like they'd be the richest company in the world. No, you're talking about $20 a user. So will Facebook then turn around and say, hey, you can get Facebook non-track for $20? Like, probably not. They're probably going to be like, hey, this is $150. but they don't actually make a whole lot of money per user. It's all in the numbers.
It's the, like general investing, it's the little drops in the bucket over time.
Exactly. The whole model is built like that. Google's built like that too. For every person who says, "Oh, I hate Facebook so much, but I love my Android phone," you're a hypocrite. I'm just going to say that. I hear that a lot in InfoSec, and it drives me crazy because they'll bastardize Facebook, and then they'll be like, "But I love my Android phone that tracks everywhere I go and everything I type and everything I do," and then Google sells it. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that Apple is significantly better, but I do know that their product is not selling ads. Or you are not their product. That's the way I should put it. So I can appreciate an Apple device because I am not their product. I pay a lot of money for their product, but I'm comfortable with that because I am not their product.
Yeah.
So, like, let's talk, like, implications of this because, you know, first response, I'm pretty sure for everybody in any InfoSec kind of thing is going to be like, dude, this is the most amazing thing in the world, right? But, like, what will that do to the internet? Quite literally, almost every internet company and every internet business makes money at this point off tracking people and selling customized ads.
Yeah, I mean, like, our telcos do it.
Correct.
Just off of that. And, like, that's something we can't control, right? Because it's done on their devices as it's passing through their network.
But every search engine, every email provider, for the most part, like basically the entire internet is run by that model. Is it a shitty model? Kind of. Is the internet the devil because of it? Yeah, probably. But at the same time, a bill like this, like, so like say I use Facebook and I use Gmail and I use Google and I use, 50 other services that exist on the internet, right?
Yeah.
How much is that going to cost me per year? Even if they only charge me $20 a year for each piece of that service.
It's going to be just as much as if you're trying to pay Comcast for cable.
Oh, it's probably going to be significantly more than that. You're talking about potentially using like 50 services, right? That might be every news site that you go to, too. It might be everything that you do. So if you look at it in that vein, all of a sudden the internet probably becomes much smaller because it has to be.
I mean, but then it also opens up another business opportunity, right? So if we think about that with each microservice, each news site offering a service, why not stand up a business that gets these wholesale discounts and offers one rate to consumers, and then they manage the whole do not track aspect as a partnership with these other sites and businesses.
Is there enough money in that? Not
I don't
for
know.
that business, but for the individual businesses.
Yeah,
Again, I'm not saying that like my dream wouldn't be to not be tracked across the internet. I'm just saying like the societal implications of a political move like this, like the economic implications are massive. I could lose my job for fuck's sake. Like,
we don't want that.
I hate to say it, like I work for an internet company. Our business in a lot of ways is ads. Like
and to add something onto it, I just read the last line of that section of the act. That they're saying that low-income consumers who are eligible for the FCC's Lifeline program would have the fee waived.
Sure. So again, you're cutting out a whole nother portion of people who would pay or be tracked and offering neither.
Yep.
So that can hurt too. Like I think it would be, not saying that it wouldn't be good, but I think it would be a drastic shift in the internet as we know it. And I honestly can't tell you if it would be good or bad at this point.
Yeah, I just know I'm happy that this is conversations happening within the government, finally, right? Like, we're getting the conversation to happen. People are becoming aware of it and starting to talk about it.
I would agree with that. So you got another one, too, and another big one that has some far-reaching implications.
Oh, and this is the fun one because this has potential far-reaching implications across the whole InfoSec community, right?
Especially tell me a story.
So, back in September... I think all of us have read the initial article about two guys who were on an engagement in the state of Iowa getting arrested for quote-unquote breaking into a county courthouse.
Let's just be clear. It was a physical pen testing engagement.
Physical.
So they were hired to break in to the courthouse.
Correct. They were hired by the state to break into a county courthouse. And they were arrested. Well, I brought this up because as of today, there was a whole bunch of activity around this. It all started with the CEO of Coalfire, the company that these guys were employed with, Tom McAndrew, releasing a public statement about the whole situation. I read it. It seems pretty well laid out. Their communications and legal department definitely had their way with it, so that some of the obviously, well, I mean, if I was a CEO, I'd be pretty fucking pissed off.
It was,
my
it
guys
was a lot more venomous than most public statements that I
Yes.
see, though. Admittedly, like
Yes,
there's a
it
lot
was.
more anger there than. But I expect that. Like,
Yeah.
I'd be pretty angry too.
Oh yeah. And he does I mean, I think he did a pretty good job at laying it out to say that it wasn't without exactly pointing a finger, but definitely showing the evidence that it came down to one specific sheriff.
Pointing a
and not
finger.
his-
Come on, he gave the guy's name. Please, we do not condone doxing or death threats or any
Yeah.
of that shit on this show because he literally gave the guy's name.
Yeah. But I mean, like, he very much pointedly said it was this one sheriff who went and gave the arrest order despite his employees having been vetted up to the point, even by his deputies. And let me see. I got a couple excerpts that I wanted to read from this because I thought they were pretty good and kind of points to that as a public statement being a little bit more venomous. Let's see. We've got. Yep. Acting professionals. Oh, here it is. It's in one of the later paragraphs. He's mentioning his guys, saying that they were acting as professionals, carrying out the state authorized obligations. Here's the section. It is unacceptable that they are now pawns in the dispute between the state and the county related to governance of the court buildings. My concern is that common sense is not prevailing in this case. The fact that this case is still ongoing is a failure of the criminal justice system in Iowa. I am also concerned that the close working relationship between the sheriff, district attorney, judges, and local politics involved may have potential conflicts of interest and impede a fair trial.
So essentially, the TLDR is this sheriff is not particularly happy that the state did something behind his back and made him look bad. That's the general TLDR.
Oh, yeah.
Ultimately, though, what does this mean?
Well, I mean, so if guys who are hired under contract...
Or girls.
Or girls, yeah.
Or whatever you identify as.
They get hired to do this and they get arrested. I mean, having potential criminal charges for doing their job. Well, I mean, people may not take it anymore. It may go away. Some of the stuff I can't even think about the reaching effects because it's not something that I've done or have had much interaction with personally. But like being able to be arrested and criminally charged for doing something you were hired to do.
I mean, you could be hired to legitimately be an actual criminal, like paid by somebody, and get arrested, and that's cool. And I'm over the course of this show, I'm sure you'll hear us make a lot of jabs at red teamers and a lot of jabs at penetration testers and that kind of stuff. But just know, like, it's all in good fun from our perspective. Like, we're having a good time with it, right? Like, it's been a little bit of an adversarial relationship throughout the industry, so we have fun. But at the same time, the true purpose of a red team or a penetration tester or anybody in that line of work is to identify gaps and holes before an attacker can. That said, I'm particularly excited most of the time that these positions exist, especially when those individuals are high-level professionals who share information. So the concept of now potentially people being afraid, depending on how this thing swings, right?
Yeah.
If these people get off like straight up, then we'll probably be okay.
Yep.
Because that'll set a precedent. But if these individuals don't get off, like that sets a precedent against paying someone to find your gaps. And in this case, like, what if it was an actual bad guy? Like, they tripped the alarm on purpose to see the response time, which I can understand why that would infuriate the sheriff. Don't get me wrong.
And that was after they closed a door that was left open.
Correct. And then picked the lock.
Yeah.
But neither here nor there on that one. Like, the precedent that could set is dangerous for us as an industry, because what happens if it extends past that precedent into I paid a company to do a red team engagement, like a digital red team engagement, and now we're arresting them for hacking because I didn't like the results, or because I'm upset, or because my blue team didn't know, or whatever the case may be. Like, there's a very dangerous precedent that something like this can set that takes away, as much as we'll give it shit, a very valuable section of this industry. And that'll probably be the only time I ever say that on this show.
Yes, and in response, part of another reason why I definitely wanted to talk about this today was some of the initial support response for Coalfire coming from people like John Strain of Black Hills, Dave Kennedy from Trusted Sec, and then Social Engineering Incorporated, is they're releasing public statements of support also. And Trusted Sec is even looks like they have posted on Twitter that they're going to take their physical penetration agreements that they have and use as their templates and making it available to the community through their GitHub.
I genuinely don't think these companies have any choice but to wager public support, because this affects all of them too. Like, this is the job that they do. This is the industry that they're in, right? Like, the outcome of this will affect all of those individuals as well, in quite possibly an industry shifting way.
Yeah, and it'll affect us on the defense side too, because if these people aren't going out there doing that, then we don't get that whole iron sharpens iron on the other side of helping us learn what to watch for.
We don't see simulated attacker techniques to even test the detection set that we have.
Exactly.
Like, we lose a lot of possibility to find things before it's a real problem. And to be honest, anything that you can detect before it becomes an incident is really where you want to be. And when a red team pops something, it's not an incident. So that's a good thing.
It's just an
exercise.
exercise.
Then we can button up that hole.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, we'll try to update on that as it goes on, because I think that one's going to be a really interesting one. So once there's something to be said, we'll get back and say it.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have good news and that everything just got let go, because they did de-escalate it from felonies down to misdemeanors, but they're still being charged criminally.
Yeah, even misdemeanors is a problem.
Oh yeah.
So does that bring us into our topic of the evening?
I think it brings us into a topic. And what are we discussing today?
So we are going to discuss today quite possibly one of the most frustrating and difficult things and problems that I have ever had to tackle, and I think I'm probably not alone in that concept. And that's operationalizing threat intelligence, specifically operationalizing indicators, and the intelligence that you have. How can you make that useful? How can you get into a hole that you can't get out of with it, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I would say the frustration is definitely there, because by the time that I had, my company had moved me out of doing SOC work every day, it was falling under the typical joke of intelligence, what an oxymoron.
Sure. So first, it might be helpful if we talk about like the pros and cons of threat intelligence and atomic indicators, so IP addresses, domains, hashes, URLs, as a detection, because there are pros and cons there.
Absolutely.
Do you want to kick us off?
So we're looking at atomic indicators, and what we're referring to here would be in the bottom of the pyramid of pain. This is this 4-stage graphic that we use to help relate concepts of easy indicators to learn, but also easy indicators to change, versus at the top of it, which is the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of malware and individual attackers, which is very hard to change, but also very hard to detect.
So let's break down real quick a pro, I think, for atomic-based indicators versus TTPs.
So I'd say one of the first ones is if we think about the infrastructure behind it. So some of the atomic indicators will be infrastructure behind malware, exploit kits, and things like that. And it is not uncommon for that infrastructure to remain in place and span multiple years of usage.
Carbonite Gang used the same IP set for years. But even more than that, like just from a pure detection play, while IP, domain, hash indicators are very easy to change, they're also relatively wide-spanning detectors. So if you have a solid amount of them and a solid piece that comes in, and a solid kind of threat intelligence platform, so to speak, you can get a very wide set of visibility that you can't with a TTP, because TTPs are so specific. You essentially have to create a detection for each type of TTP and each thing that could happen there. And that is much more time consuming. So especially younger programs, like visibility better than no visibility. And I don't know if we said it last week or not, but like in this world, like visibility is key. If you don't have it, you can't find it. So the ease of tossing some of that stuff in there and saying like, hey, boom, here we are. We have some visibility, and some pretty wide spanning visibility across the entirety of the attacker kill chain or across multiple TTPs is helpful, even though it can be changed pretty quickly.
Yes. And then, of course, then we deal with the opposite side of that, where you can start dealing with alert fatigue because of how noisy it can be.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, so if you get something like, let's say, an IP address that's owned by GoDaddy, and the indicator actually came coupled with a domain, but you receive it as only the IP address, which is likely to be hosting thousands of other websites. Anytime a picture or some resource comes up related to that IP address, it's triggering an alert.
The same can be said of like a lot of C2 infrastructure and a lot of like initial attacker infrastructure. They use like over-the-shelf common VPN services, so like private internet access, DigitalOcean, things like that to kind of hide themselves, right? Or Tor. So those things, depending on the environment, can tend to be pretty loud because, a lot of normal people use that stuff too. So
and that's where analysts start to complain, right? With how noisy it is, how much busy work they're doing versus what they're getting out of it.
Correct. So you end up in this situation where like the time it takes to analyze an atomic indicator is relatively high. Because if my product tells me that I've got a suspicious IP, that's my only context. So that's the problem. Like TTPs are very specific contextually. If you give me an indicator, a hash being a little bit different, admittedly, but hashes can change quickly, but a hash is a hash.
Yeah.
But domains, IPs, like that website could be compromised and could be fixed or it could not, but like you have no context of why something connected to that. Yeah. So you have to go find it. So like time to analyze is pretty high. So if you burn out and have hundreds of these a day or more, right, you end up in a very different position.
Yeah, and I've seen some of the paid and public ones get super noisy that it then becomes an exercise either in keeping busy or, going at it from the other way of only implementing ones that have been tested to be within a threshold of signal to noise that is acceptable for your SOC.
Sure. And there's a lot of different places that you can get these indicators, right? So you can source them internally and from things that you've seen and things that you've done. Those tend to be the best. You can also pay companies like FireEye or CrowdStrike or a whole bunch of other companies a whole lot of money to give you their feeds. There's pros and cons to that. It's going to expand your visibility. But at the same time, they're not necessarily going to be specific to your industry or your vector. So you're going to see stuff across everything. And any shop that's selling a product, they obviously want to put out enough of that product for it to be valuable. So they might put out reports for stuff that's no longer relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like, indicators from 2014 that were only targeting banks in Japan and you're a hospital in the US, right? Like,
yep.
Do I really care about this? I mean, there may be shared infrastructure, but what if it was just a targeted campaign for just that? Like, that's that context we're talking about that I haven't seen too many companies provide their indicators with that context to keep that analysis time down.
And a lot of them, they might provide some context. So like any of the big companies, any of the paid feeds, you're going to get a report, right? So it's going to tell you what they saw happen, and then it's going to give you the indicators. And that's relatively beneficial. But then you have to go read that report every time something fires, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads into this whole concept of like the importance of curation of intelligence. So yeah, you can go pay FireEye, or you can use a free feed, and there's a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. And you can ingest all these things from a free feed into a TIP or a threat intelligence platform. There's several free ones, MISP being one of the bigger free ones. There's several paid ones like Anomaly. Those are going to let you like bring stuff in and then share with your SIM or whatever other tool that you have. And that's useful. But I genuinely, as much as I can, strongly encourage that anybody on the blue team side, maybe it's dedicated CTI, maybe it's not dedicated CTI, and maybe your defenders or your general defenders or your analysts are doing this work. But at the same time, curation becomes so important because you need to be able to look at what's in your environment, and then you need to be able to easily and quickly get rid of things and say, like, this isn't relevant to me. This isn't relevant to me. Oh, that's kind of relevant. Oh, that was patched or fixed like last week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you could have fun even figuring out which domains are no longer active, right? So if it's, then you start to learn things like what's coming over adware and realized that that was only going to be active for 15 minutes. And
You know the upside of a no longer active domain?
tell me.
You'll never detect on it, so it doesn't really matter.
So that reminded me of something else in one of the stocks that I worked in as a thing that we did too, which is actually setting up an expiration policy. So this one utilized Splunk, and we used a couple of lookup files. One that kept a 90-day search of indicators that were coming in, and after 90 days, they were rolled off into an archive, and then did a weekly search on that archive to watch
let's
for
go-
the old infrastructure.
Let's go one step farther into maturity with that concept, because I agree, you absolutely have to roll off indicators, right?
Yeah.
Let's go one step further down that pathway, though. So, not only how do you pick a date, because that's relatively arbitrary, right? You can talk about 90 days, you can do a year, whatever.
Yeah.
Now, if your tip or whatever it is that you have allows for any kind of smart tagging, which is one of the reasons why I suggest like ingesting your indicators into an intelligence platform and then from there into your SIEM, because you can build a smart kind of tagging system there, and that gives you some benefit. Specifically, that benefit being, oh, I can tag this indicator as attacker infrastructure, so I can let that live forever or much longer. But this is a compromised website. Like, I don't have to let that one live. I can let that one roll off pretty quick, because typically compromised websites don't stay compromised for very long.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you can do other cool stuff too, like utilizing the MITRE ATT&CK framework for that additional data enrichment, right? So if something becomes tagged as, a phishing link, the moment you see it, you can immediately compare the behavior that you're recognizing with why it was originally listed.
Exactly. So for anybody who hasn't figured this out yet, we're basically starting to come into the detections part of the show. And these are going to be a little broad this week because threat intelligence is a relatively broad topic, but we will have plenty of them. Speaking of that, so like you can do, so when we get into that tagging system, you can say like this is C2 infrastructure. Well, C2, I only want to see internal to external. I don't necessarily want to see external to internal. That's not C2 infrastructure. So that IP is irrelevant. It's all about curation, smart tagging, and understanding how you're going to use this stuff. That becomes the big piece and the important piece. And it's a crap ton of work, admittedly. But I've always followed one structure and methodology in this field. Doing a lot of work up front keeps you from doing even more work when you have to handle the same thing over and over again.
Absolutely.
And I'd much rather do that.
Same here. I mean, isn't that why we take the time in the concept realm of everything to work on policies and procedures and that kind of thing, so it doesn't have to be redone the same way every time?
Mm-hmm. And as we go through this process, we can actually share some additional intelligence tools. So maybe you don't have MISP, or maybe you're just using, you have Splunk or Elk, and you're just using public feeds or whatever the case may be. So I'm going to give a shout out to a tool that I've played with a very small amount, but at the same time, I'll still give them a little bit of a shout out because I think it's cool. It's a free tool, but you do have to make an account called PulseDive. Basically, they're a big Intel search engine. So they'll go do some geolocation, some whois, they'll look for blacklists, they'll try to provide you some context around that for free. So if you can't get it from where you are, you can try to get it from a service like that. And VirusTotal will do a lot of the same thing. Passive Total, there's a whole lot of services that'll provide you some contextual information that are worth having when you're talking about atomic indicators specifically.
Yes, and in researching this myself, I found a website with an individual who had some pre-configured things to do some data enrichment for this stuff. Of course, the link will be posted in the blog post after, but it's from a website called justhackerthings.com, and it's specifically about enriching IP addresses with Python. And his whole setup will do the maxmind GeoIP to give you GeoIP coordinates, do both, depending on if it's a domain or an IP address, to reverse DNS or any of the lookups related to that, give you CIDR ranges. But the cool thing that I liked about it is once you provide a Shodan API key, it pulls API over the API metadata and any information that's stored in the Shodan database and shows that relevant to the IP address also.
Nice. I do like the contextual information. I'm gonna go forth with one additional note for detecting and using this stuff in your environment. Being specific. So this gets really interesting for a couple of reasons. So IPs are a dime a dozen, right? IPs change all the time. And I mean, one IP that, like your GoDaddy example, right?
Yep.
However, let's say maybe I want to detect on IPs attempting VPN login that I have some intel around. All of a sudden, I've parsed down my potential false positive rate pretty significantly. And honestly, anything that I determine to be relatively suspicious that's trying or succeeding at a VPN login, even if it's AWS or DigitalOcean or any of these other sites, that becomes infinitely more valuable to me, because why should somebody be logging into my VPN from DigitalOcean?
Correct.
So being specific is huge in terms of this. I mean, you can watch a hash pass the network, but if you've got endpoint tools, you can look for a hash there. Like specificity of use in your detection set, because you might want to tune out a whole bunch of stuff that's just IPs that exist out here, like IPs that exist from pure network connections, but you might want all of those on for VPN, because your noise signal to noise ratio is completely different. So like start thinking about how these indicators will affect you in different ways in your organization. And then you can get some pretty specific sets to make these things very valuable and very low noise.
Which is ultimately what we're trying to get to, is the high signal, low noise on any of these things coming into any of our defense security operations people.
For the most part, but I will soapbox for a moment here.
Do it.
Because I agree with the fidelity thing. However, I think tracking detections by fidelity alone loses value and does not cover the whole picture. I think realistically, when you're talking about a detection landscape, you need to consider fidelity. So for anybody unaware, fidelity is how often it's true positive to false positive. You need to consider frequency, which is how often you're going to see it, how often it fires, and you need to consider intent. If this is bad, not if this fires, if this is bad, how bad is it? And how bad is it going to be? So when you start to kind of graph out those three things specifically, you start to get into this very interesting concept where like some things that might have gone before you might want to keep, some things that you didn't have you might want. Like there's a lot of really interesting concepts when you start to look at the world a little bit differently and start to expand how you look for this stuff, while still taking into consideration like analyst fatigue and all that kind of stuff.
Which we can definitely discuss on another one, because analyst fatigue and things like that is a very long topic that I know we both will soapbox about for a while.
Oh God, yeah, that's true. So any other like good tips, use cases, or detections for utilizing threat intelligence?
I think I think we covered a pretty good amount that people can start thinking about and putting out there. But I'd say probably to reiterate the contextualizing to your environment, and you mentioned risk there at the end about what actually impact it would have on your environment. That's a really good time to get your organization's incident response plan out and compare these things with how your organization's classifying this stuff.
I genuinely agree, and as we all know, all things documented are really, really good until something happens. Then the documentation basically all goes out the window.
But at least the documentation gives you something to start with, and you're not mentally like running around all crazy.
Correct. Well, then I guess that basically covers the topic, doesn't it?
I think so.
Cool. Well, any parting words of wisdom?
Stay wonderful and go hop in. If you got a B-Sides coming up in your community, go check it out. Take a little bit of risk. Talk to a couple people you haven't talked to before. You never know. That may just be your next industry friend.
Or podcast partner, for that matter.
Go Derby.
Right? So, with that said, we'll be back in about 2 weeks. Go forth. Be spooky. Dress up in funny costumes and find badness. Bye.